You watch as others effortlessly navigate office politics and rise to positions of power, while your honest work goes unnoticed and unrewarded. Every day you pour your integrity into projects and relationships, yet somehow the cunning and calculating seem to advance while you remain stuck, wondering why virtue alone isn't enough to secure your success. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political theorist who spent years studying power, observing princes, and understanding the brutal realities of leadership in Renaissance Italy. Through my service to the Florentine Republic and my careful analysis of successful rulers, I discovered that thinking like a prince isn't about abandoning morality. It's about understanding the strategic realities of power and influence. The principles I'll share will transform how you approach leadership, negotiation, and strategic thinking in your modern world. What I learned about princely wisdom during the most turbulent political era in Italian history will give you the tools to navigate today's complex power dynamics with both effectiveness and integrity. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of strategic thinking. When I received my letter of appointment to the second chancery of the Florentine Republic in 1498, I thought I understood power. I was 29 years old, educated in the classics, and filled with republican ideals about virtue and justice governing human affairs. How naive I was. That parchment document, sealed with the red wax of Florence, would become my education in the brutal realities of political life. My first assignment was to observe and report on the various Italian city-states, their leaders, and their strategies. I traveled from court to court, watching princes and republics alike struggle for survival in a world where yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's executioner. In Pisa, I witnessed a siege that dragged on for years because the Florentine commanders lacked the will to make hard decisions. In Imola, I watched Cesare Borgia demonstrate how decisive action could accomplish in days what others failed to achieve in months. These early experiences shattered my academic understanding of leadership. I had believed that good intentions and moral behavior would naturally lead to good outcomes. I learned instead that the world rewards those who understand power's true nature, not those who merely wish it worked differently. The princes who survived weren't necessarily the most virtuous, they were the most strategically minded. I observed Lorenzo de' Medici's son navigating the treacherous waters of papal politics, using charm when it served him and force when charm failed. I watched smaller rulers ally themselves with stronger powers, only to be consumed by those same allies when their usefulness ended. Most importantly, I learned that political survival required a kind of thinking that my classical education had never taught me. The turning point came when I realized that my republican ideals, while noble, were insufficient for the world as it actually existed. Florence itself was proof of this harsh truth. Despite our love of liberty and our commitment to republican virtue, we constantly found ourselves at the mercy of more pragmatic neighboring powers. Our enemies didn't care about our philosophical purity, they cared about their own advantage. This realization didn't make me cynical, it made me realistic. I began to understand that true leadership required not just good intentions, but effective methods. The greatest leaders weren't those who adhered most strictly to moral codes, but those who could achieve moral outcomes through strategic thinking. They understood that in a world where others played by rules of power, playing only by rules of virtue was a luxury that few could afford. Through these early years of service, I developed what would become my central insight, that thinking like a prince means accepting responsibility for outcomes, not just intentions. It means understanding that the world is as it is, not as we wish it were, and adapting our methods accordingly. The secret diplomatic correspondence I carried between Florence and the Papal States revealed the most valuable lesson of my political education. Even the most brilliant strategist can overreach. Cesare Borgia was the closest thing to a perfect prince I had ever encountered. Yet I watched him fall from absolute power to complete ruin in a matter of months. When I first met Borgia in 1502, he commanded armies, controlled vast territories, and seemed destined to unite central Italy under his rule. He possessed every quality I would later write about in The Prince. He was feared by enemies, respected by allies, and absolutely ruthless in pursuing his objectives. He had eliminated rivals, secured his supply lines, and built a military machine that could crush any opposition. Yet within 2 years, he was dead, his empire dissolved. His name a cautionary tale. What destroyed Borgia wasn't external force. It was his failure to account for the one variable he couldn't control: his father's mortality. Pope Alexander VI had been the foundation of Caesar's power, providing both legitimacy and resources for his campaigns. When the Pope fell gravely ill in August 1503, Cesare faced a crisis that all his strategic brilliance couldn't solve. He had built his entire empire on a single point of failure. I was in Rome during those critical weeks, carrying messages between various parties as the political landscape shifted hourly. I watched Borgia, this master of calculated moves, make increasingly desperate decisions as he realized his position was collapsing. The same boldness that had built his power now accelerated his downfall. He alienated potential allies through frantic maneuvering, revealed his weaknesses to enemies who had been waiting for their moment, and ultimately found himself isolated precisely when he needed support most. The lesson burned itself into my mind. No strategy, however brilliant, can survive the failure to plan for fundamental changes in circumstances. Borgia had mastered every aspect of power except succession planning. He had assumed his father would live long enough for him to establish independent legitimacy. That single miscalculation destroyed everything he had built. But there was a deeper lesson in Borgia's fall, one that would shape my understanding of princely thinking forever. Fortune, as the ancients called it, plays a role in all human affairs. The wisest prince isn't the one who ignores fortune's power, but the one who prepares for its inevitable turns. Borgia's mistake wasn't trusting his father. It was building a system that couldn't survive his father's absence. This taught me that thinking like a prince means building resilient strategies, not just successful ones. It means creating multiple sources of strength, developing contingency plans, and never allowing your entire position to depend on factors beyond your control. The prince who survives isn't the one who never faces crisis, but the one whose preparations allow them to navigate crisis when it inevitably comes. Among the ancient Roman military standards I studied, none captured my attention like the bronze eagles that legions carried into battle. These symbols of raw power taught me something profound. Successful leaders must embody both the lion's strength and the fox's cunning, knowing when each nature serves their purposes best. During my diplomatic missions, I encountered leaders who possessed only one of these qualities, and I watched them fail repeatedly. Pope Julius II was pure lion fierce, direct, and utterly committed to achieving his goals through force. His aggressive campaigns succeeded brilliantly when facing weak opposition, but his inability to negotiate or adapt cost him dearly when facing more sophisticated enemies. Conversely, I knew merchants and minor nobles who were masters of subtle manipulation, but lacked the courage to act decisively when circumstances demanded bold action. The principle crystallized for me while observing a territorial dispute between Florence and Pisa. Our commanders spent months crafting elaborate diplomatic solutions, sending envoys with carefully worded proposals, and seeking allies who might pressure Pisa into compliance. They were playing the fox game perfectly, except Pisa had no intention of negotiating. They respected only force. Meanwhile, when we finally resorted to military action, we attacked without adequate preparation or commitment, failing to press our advantages when we had them. We had neither the fox's complete cleverness nor the lion's full strength. True princely thinking requires reading each situation to determine which nature it demands. When facing direct threats to your authority, you must be the lion. Your response must be immediate, overwhelming, and decisive enough that others think twice before challenging you again. When navigating complex political relationships, you must be the fox, understanding hidden motivations, anticipating multiple moves ahead, and achieving your objectives through intelligence rather than confrontation. The key insight is that these aren't opposing strategies, they're complementary tools in the prince's arsenal. The fox without the lion's backing lacks credibility. Opponents know they can push you until you break, because you'll never fight back. The lion without the fox's wisdom wastes strength on unnecessary battles and makes enemies where they could have made allies. In modern terms, this principle applies whether you're managing a team, negotiating a business deal, or navigating office politics. Sometimes you must establish clear boundaries and consequences. Be the lion who shows that certain lines cannot be crossed. Other times you must work through influence, persuasion, and strategic patience. Be the fox who achieves objectives without direct confrontation. The most successful leaders I've observed understand that people need to see both natures in you. They need to know you can be reasonable, flexible, and diplomatic, but they also need to believe you will act decisively when pushed too far. This dual nature creates what I call respectful cooperation. Others work with you not just because they like you, but because they understand the consequences of working against you. The prince who masters this principle never has to choose between being feared and being loved. Instead, they earn both fear and love by demonstrating that they prefer cooperation but are fully prepared for conflict. The Venetian diplomatic masks I studied during my missions taught me a truth that makes many uncomfortable. There is a profound difference between lying to harm others and withholding information to protect legitimate interests. The ornate masks worn by Venetian ambassadors weren't symbols of dishonesty. They were tools of strategic communication in a world where revealing everything meant inviting destruction. I learnt this principle the hard way during Florence's negotiations with French King Louis XII. Our ambassador, believing that complete honesty would earn the king's trust, revealed our entire military situation, our financial constraints, and our internal political divisions. He thought transparency would demonstrate good faith. Instead, it invited exploitation. Louis immediately adjusted his demands, knowing exactly how much pressure we could withstand before breaking. This experience taught me that what people call deception often includes several different categories of communication, each with its own moral weight. Malicious lies, deliberate falsehoods intended to harm innocent parties, represent a corruption of princely thinking, but strategic withholding of information from those who would use it against you. That's not deception, that's prudence. Consider a modern parallel. When you're negotiating a salary increase, you don't volunteer information about your personal financial difficulties or your willingness to accept less. That's not dishonesty. That's protecting your legitimate interests. In a negotiation where the other party is certainly not volunteering information that would weaken their position, the prince understands that truth exists in layers. There's the truth you share with trusted advisors, the truth you share with allies, the truth you share with neutral parties, and the truth you share with opponents. Each relationship and each situation requires its own level of disclosure. Sharing classified information with enemies isn't honesty. It's betrayal of those who depend on you. I developed what I call the necessity test for strategic communication. Before withholding information or presenting it in a particular way, I ask, Is this action necessary to protect legitimate interests, or am I simply avoiding accountability? Am I preserving my ability to serve those who depend on me, or am I covering up failures that harm others? The critical distinction is intention and consequence. When you withhold your negotiation strategy from an opponent, you're creating space for both parties to reach an acceptable agreement. When you lie about product defects to customers, you're transferring harm from yourself to innocent parties. The first represents strategic thinking. The second represents moral failure. Venetian diplomats understood this principle intuitively. They wore masks not to deceive about their identities. Everyone knew who they were to create psychological space for difficult conversations. The mask allowed both parties to discuss sensitive topics without the personal animosity that direct confrontation might create. Modern princes must master this same art. You learn when to reveal your full position and when to hold back strategic information. You understand that protecting your plans from those who would sabotage them isn't dishonesty, it's responsibility. You recognize that sometimes the greatest service you can provide is to absorb the burden of difficult decisions without requiring others to share the psychological cost of making them. The Roman dice of Fortuna that I kept on my desk served as a daily reminder of leadership's most important paradox. While chance influences all human affairs, the prepared mind creates its own opportunities. These ancient gaming pieces, worn smooth by countless hands, taught me that princes must respect fortune's power while refusing to become its passive victims. I witnessed this principle during the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, where I served as a military observer. The French forces had superior numbers, better positioning, and more experienced commanders. By every measure of conventional analysis, they should have achieved a decisive victory. Instead, a series of seemingly random events, an ammunition explosion, confused orders during a crucial moment, the death of their most competent general by a stray cannonball turned certain victory into devastating defeat. The lesson wasn't that preparation doesn't matter, but that even the best preparations must account for uncertainty. The wise prince builds systems that function regardless of fortune's interventions. When I studied successful rulers like Ferdinand of Aragon, I noticed they never relied on single strategies or concentrated all their strength in one approach. Ferdinand maintained multiple alliance options, diversified his sources of revenue, and developed redundant communication systems, so that no single failure could cripple his ability to respond to changing circumstances. This is what I mean by creating your own luck. It's not that successful leaders avoid misfortune, it's that they position themselves to benefit from unexpected opportunities while minimizing their vulnerability to unexpected disasters. They understand that fortune favors those who can recognize and act upon possibilities that others miss. During Florence's negotiations with various Italian powers, I learned to distinguish between events we could control and events we could only prepare for. We couldn't control whether France would invade Italy, but we could prepare responses for different invasion scenarios. We couldn't control whether the Pope would live or die, but we could build relationships that would serve us, regardless of papal succession. The prince who thinks strategically about fortune develops what I call adaptive resilience. Instead of creating rigid plans that break under pressure, they create flexible frameworks that can accommodate multiple outcomes. They build relationships with various parties so they're not dependent on any single alliance. They develop multiple sources of strength so no single weakness can destroy them. Modern leaders must apply this same principle whether they're building businesses, managing teams, or advancing their careers. The executive who assumes their industry will never change finds themselves obsolete when technology disrupts their market. The manager who builds their entire strategy around one key employee discovers their vulnerability when that person leaves unexpectedly, but fortune rewards preparation in subtle ways. When you've built strong relationships across multiple areas, opportunities appear that others never see. When you've developed diverse skills and knowledge, you can recognize possibilities in situations that seem like dead ends to others. When you've prepared for various contingencies, you can act quickly while others are still trying to understand what happened. The dice of Fortuna taught me that wise princes don't fear uncertainty. They prepare for it so thoroughly that they can navigate whatever circumstances arise, while maintaining their essential purposes and values. The council chamber seal that validated our most sensitive deliberations in Florence represented a truth that separates successful leaders from failed ones. Your advisors will either strengthen your judgment or destroy it, and the choice is entirely yours. This official stamp, pressed into red wax on documents that shaped the fate of our republic, witnessed countless examples of how the wrong counsel leads to catastrophic decisions. I observed this principle most clearly during the rise and fall of Piero Soderini, Florence's Gonfalonier for life. Soderini was intelligent, well-meaning, and genuinely committed to Republican ideals. But he surrounded himself with advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. When the Medici family began their campaign to return to power, Soderini's counselors assured him that Florentine loyalty to the Republic would protect him. They dismissed early warning signs, minimized obvious threats, and convinced him that his good intentions would overcome political realities. The result was predictable. When Spanish troops approached Florence in 1512, Soderini found himself completely unprepared for the crisis his advisors had assured him would never come. He was overthrown within days, and the republic he had tried to preserve was destroyed. His mistake wasn't poor judgment, it was allowing poor advisors to shield him from uncomfortable truths. This taught me to distinguish between three types of people who seek positions of influence: flatterers who tell you what pleases you, who tell you what benefits them, and genuine advisors who tell you what serves your long-term interests. The first two categories are dangerous because they create false confidence in bad decisions. Only the third category provides the clear-eyed assessment that effective leadership requires. I developed what I call the disagreement test for evaluating potential advisors. Anyone who consistently agrees with my initial position is either not thinking independently or not being honest about their thoughts. The most valuable advisors are those who can challenge my assumptions, point out weaknesses in my reasoning, and force me to consider alternatives I might have missed. They're willing to be temporarily unpopular by telling me hard truths. But finding such advisors is only half the challenge. The other half is creating an environment where honest counsel can flourish. If you punish people for bringing bad news, you'll stop receiving accurate information about developing problems. If you reward agreement over analysis, you'll surround yourself with yes-men who confirm your biases rather than strengthen your judgment. The prince must also learn to manage different types of expertise without being overwhelmed by conflicting advice. During military campaigns, I learned to consult engineers about fortifications, diplomats about enemy intentions, and treasury officials about sustainable costs. Each advisor provided essential perspective, but none possessed complete understanding of the overall situation. My job was to synthesize their specialized knowledge into coherent strategy. Modern leaders face the same challenge whether they're running companies, managing departments, or leading projects. The temptation is always to surround yourself with people who make you feel smart and validated. But the wise leader actively seeks advisors who complement their weaknesses, challenge their assumptions, and provide honest feedback about results. The council chamber seal reminded me daily that important decisions require input from trusted sources, but the final responsibility for those decisions always rests with the leader. Good advisors inform your judgment. They never replace it. The dual-faced Roman coin I carried during my diplomatic missions perfectly captured Leadership's most controversial truth. While it's wonderful to be both feared and loved, if you must choose between them, being feared provides more reliable results than being beloved. This ancient currency, showing different faces on each side, taught me that effective leadership sometimes requires accepting unpopularity to achieve necessary outcomes. This principle emerged from watching Piero Soderini's downfall alongside Caesar Borgia's rise. Soderini was genuinely loved by many Florentines. He was kind, accessible, and sincerely committed to Republican values. People enjoyed his company and respected his character. But when crisis came, that affection couldn't save him because it hadn't established the authority necessary to make hard decisions. His enemies didn't fear the consequences of opposing him, so they destroyed him without hesitation. Borgia, by contrast, was rarely beloved but universally feared. His subjects obeyed not because they felt personal warmth toward him, but because they understood the swift and certain consequences of defying his authority. This fear-based respect allowed him to implement policies that served long-term stability, even when they caused short-term hardship. Until his father's death eliminated his power base, Borgia's territories experienced greater peace and prosperity. The neighboring regions, governed by more beloved but less effective rulers. The mistake most people make is assuming that fear-based leadership requires cruelty or injustice. That's not what I'm describing. The fear I'm referring to is respect for consequences, the understanding that crossing certain lines will result in predictable, proportionate responses. It's the fear that comes from consistent enforcement of reasonable standards, not from arbitrary punishment or emotional volatility. Consider a modern workplace scenario. The manager, who desperately wants to be liked by their team, often avoids difficult conversations about performance problems. They hope that kindness and patience will eventually inspire improvement. Meanwhile, their strongest performers become frustrated watching substandard work go unaddressed, and the organization's effectiveness gradually deteriorates. The manager's desire to be beloved undermines their ability to serve the team's genuine interests. Compare this to the manager who establishes clear expectations, provides necessary support, and then consistently enforces consequences when standards aren't met. Team members might not always enjoy these interactions, but they understand the boundaries and feel secure knowing that quality work is valued and protected. This creates what I call respectful productivity. People perform well, not just because they want to please the leader, but because they understand the system rewards excellence and addresses deficiencies. The key insight is that being feared and being hated are entirely different things. People fear effective leaders because they respect their competence and consistency, not because they expect arbitrary punishment. This kind of fear actually builds trust because people know what to expect and can rely on fair treatment according to established principles. Love, while wonderful when genuine, is unreliable because it depends on emotions that can change quickly based on circumstances beyond your control. When you must make decisions that hurt some people to benefit others, love often transforms into resentment. Fear based on consistent competence, however, remains stable because it's grounded in demonstrated capability rather than personal feelings. The wise prince builds both qualities but prioritizes establishing credible authority first. Once people understand that you're competent and consistent, affection often follows naturally because security and predictability are themselves lovable qualities in leadership. The crown of thorns replica that sat in my study reminded me daily of a truth that every rising leader must understand. Those who weren't born to power face unique obstacles that hereditary leaders never encounter. But these very obstacles can become sources of unexpected strength. This symbol of sacrifice and earned authority taught me that new princes must transform their disadvantages into strategic advantages. When I studied Francesco Sforza's rise from mercenary captain to Duke of Milan, I witnessed this principle in action. Sforza faced constant challenges to his legitimacy. Nobles questioned his right to rule. Neighboring powers viewed him as an upstart. And his own subjects wondered whether he possessed the qualities necessary for leadership. Unlike hereditary rulers who inherit established systems and unquestioned authority, Sforza had to prove himself repeatedly. But these challenges forced him to develop capabilities that hereditary princes often lack. He understood his subjects' concerns because he had lived among common soldiers. He knew how to build loyalty because he couldn't assume it. He developed superior strategic thinking because he couldn't rely on inherited advantages to overcome opposition. Most importantly, he created new systems based on merit and effectiveness rather than tradition and privilege. This pattern repeated throughout my observations of new leaders. They faced what I call the legitimacy gap, the period between assuming authority and earning genuine acceptance. During this vulnerable phase, they couldn't make the same assumptions that established leaders take for granted. Every decision faced extra scrutiny, every mistake received amplified criticism, and every success required more evidence to be believed. However, leaders who navigate this period successfully emerge stronger than those who inherited their positions. They've been tested in ways that hereditary leaders never experience. They understand power from multiple perspectives: what it feels like to lack it, how to earn it, and why it must be used responsibly. This comprehensive understanding makes them more effective once they achieve secure authority. I experienced this principle personally when I transitioned from academic study to practical politics. My classical education provided theoretical knowledge, but it hadn't prepared me for the skepticism I encountered from career diplomats and established political figures. They questioned whether someone without family connections or inherited wealth could understand the realities of power. I had to prove my competence through results rather than relying on credentials or assumptions. The new prince must master what I call earned authority, building credibility through demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. This requires superior preparation, better communication skills, and more consistent performance than established leaders need to maintain their positions. It also requires developing thick skin because people will test your resolve more frequently and more aggressively than they would test someone with traditional credentials. But these demands create advantages that last long after the initial legitimacy gap closes. New princes develop deeper relationships with their supporters because those relationships are based on mutual choice rather than inherited obligation. They build more resilient systems because they can't rely on tradition to maintain stability. They understand change better because they've lived through fundamental transformation themselves. Modern leaders who rise from unconventional backgrounds, whether they're first-generation executives, entrepreneurs from working-class families, or professionals who changed careers, face similar dynamics. The key is recognizing that the extra skepticism you encounter isn't necessarily unfair. It's an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that others may never develop. Your authority will be more secure once earned because it's based on proven performance rather than assumed competence. The treaty, sealed and broken, wax that littered my desk after Florence's various diplomatic negotiations, taught me that political alliances are tools, not relationships, and treating them as permanent commitments leads to strategic paralysis and ultimate betrayal. These remnants of broken agreements showed me that the wise prince forms partnerships based on mutual benefit while maintaining the independence to act when circumstances change. I learned this lesson painfully during Florence's alliance with King Louis XII of France. Our Republican leadership believed that loyalty and consistency would earn us a special relationship with the French crown. We provided military support for French campaigns in Italy, offered financial assistance during their conflicts with other powers, and consistently voted with French interests in diplomatic councils. We thought we were building lasting friendship. When Louis faced pressure from the Holy League and needed to consolidate his position, he abandoned Florence without hesitation. Our years of loyal service meant nothing when supporting us became inconvenient for French interests. We had confused tactical cooperation with strategic partnership, and we paid the price through diplomatic isolation when we most needed allies. This experience taught me to distinguish between reliable partners and opportunistic ones. Reliable partners share genuine interests that create natural cooperation. They benefit when you benefit, and they suffer when you suffer. Opportunistic partners cooperate only when it costs them nothing and provides immediate advantage. The former category justifies investment in long-term relationships. The latter requires constant vigilance and limited commitment. Venice provided the perfect example of reliable partnership thinking. The Venetian Republic never confused emotional loyalty with strategic alignment. They would ally with former enemies when circumstances made cooperation beneficial, and they would oppose former allies when interests diverged. This approach seemed cynical to many observers, but it allowed Venice to survive and prosper for over 1,000 years, while more loyal powers were destroyed by their inflexible commitments. The key insight is that effective alliances serve specific purposes for limited durations. When I negotiated agreements on Florence's behalf, I learned to focus on concrete, measurable benefits rather than vague promises of friendship. Strong alliances specify what each party contributes, what each party receives, and under what circumstances the agreement might need revision or termination. This doesn't mean being treacherous or dishonest. Quite the opposite. Clear, limited agreements prevent the misunderstandings that destroy relationships. When both parties understand exactly what they're committing to and for how long, they can cooperate effectively without creating unrealistic expectations. Modern leaders must apply this same principle, whether they're forming business partnerships, building team coalitions, or navigating organizational politics. The person who promises to support you no matter what is either naive or lying. The person who offers specific cooperation for specific benefits within specific timeframes is someone you can work with reliably. I developed what I call the interest alignment test for evaluating potential alliances. Before entering any partnership, I ask, do our interests genuinely overlap? Or are we simply convenient for each other right now? Can this relationship survive changes in our respective circumstances, or does it depend on everything staying exactly as it is today? The strongest alliances survive these tests because they're built on genuine mutual benefit rather than temporary convenience. They can adapt to changing circumstances because both parties understand that their cooperation serves larger purposes than immediate advantage. They endure because ending them would hurt both partners, not just one. The sundial fragment that I recovered from ancient Roman ruins became my most treasured artifact because it represented leadership's most critical skill, recognizing the precise moment when decisive action transforms from impossible to inevitable. This broken timepiece, weathered by centuries but still casting shadows that marked the passage of hours, taught me that timing separates successful bold moves from catastrophic miscalculations. I witnessed this principle most dramatically during Pope Julius II's decision to attack Bologna in 1506. For months, various advisors had urged military action against the rebellious city. The same strategic arguments existed in March as in October. Bologna's defenses were strong. The costs would be enormous, and failure would damage papal authority throughout Italy. What changed wasn't the objective situation but the political climate surrounding it. By October, several factors had aligned that made bold action not just possible but necessary. French support for Bologna had weakened due to other diplomatic priorities. The harvest season meant Bologna's defenders couldn't count on countryside support, and rumors of Julius's illness created pressure to demonstrate strength before rivals could exploit perceived weakness. The Pope recognized this convergence and acted decisively, achieving in weeks what might have been impossible just months earlier. This taught me that timing isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about recognizing when multiple factors create windows of opportunity that won't remain open indefinitely. The leader who waits for certainty never acts, while the leader who acts without reading the moment often destroys themselves through premature boldness. During my service to Florence, I learned to identify what I call timing indicators, signals that suggest when bold moves might succeed. These include when your opponents are distracted by other problems, when your supporters are most unified and motivated, when external circumstances provide cover or justification for dramatic action, and when delaying action would cost more than acting immediately. I observed these indicators during Florence's decision to finally besiege Pisa. For years, we had debated military action against our rebellious former territory. The same military advisors offered the same strategic assessments repeatedly. What finally triggered decisive action wasn't new analysis, but recognition that our international credibility was suffering from prolonged indecision. Other Italian powers began viewing Florence as weak and indecisive. The cost of continued delay had become greater than the cost of potential failure. The siege succeeded not because our military position had improved dramatically, but because we acted when Pisa's allies were occupied elsewhere and when our own population was finally unified behind military action. Timing transformed a risky venture into an achievable objective. Modern leaders must develop this same sensitivity to timing, whether they're launching new initiatives, reorganizing teams, or making career moves. The business plan that fails in January might succeed in June if market conditions change. The organizational restructuring that would create chaos during busy season might be welcomed during a slower period. When people have time to adapt, the key is building what I call temporal awareness, constantly monitoring the factors that influence whether bold action will succeed or fail. This includes understanding your own organization's rhythms, tracking external pressures and opportunities, and recognizing when various stakeholders are most receptive to change. Bold moves require courage, but successful bold moves require courage combined with strategic patience. The prince who can wait for the right moment while remaining ready to act quickly when it arrives possesses one of leadership's most valuable skills. As my broken sundial reminded me daily, time moves constantly, but moments of perfect alignment are rare and fleeting. The broken sword hilt that I kept as a reminder of Florence's military defeats taught me that betrayal and opposition are inevitable components of leadership, and a prince who doesn't prepare for them will be destroyed, not by their enemy's strength, but by their own naive assumptions about human nature. This damaged weapon, its blade long since shattered, represented every leader who fell because they trusted too completely in others. Loyalty. My education in betrayal began with observing Cesare Borgia's relationship with his captain Vitelli. Vitelli had served Borgia loyally for years, leading successful campaigns and demonstrating personal courage in numerous battles. When other commanders questioned Borgia's strategies, Vitelli defended them. When rival powers attempted to recruit Borgia's officers, Vitelli remained steadfast. By every visible measure, he was the most loyal member of Borgia's inner circle. Yet when Borgia faced his crisis following his father's death, Vitelli immediately began secret negotiations with Borgia's enemies. The same man who had risked his life for Borgia's causes abandoned him the moment continuing loyalty became inconvenient. This wasn't exceptional moral failure, was human nature responding to changed circumstances. Vitelli's earlier loyalty had been genuine, but it was conditional on Borgia's ability to reward it. This observation taught me that most betrayal isn't motivated by malice, but by self-preservation. People support you when doing so serves their interests, and they abandon you when continued support threatens their survival. Understanding this pattern doesn't make you cynical. It makes you realistic about the nature of political relationships. The wise prince anticipates betrayal by never becoming so dependent on any individual that their defection can cause catastrophic damage. During my diplomatic missions, I learned to develop multiple sources for critical information, create redundant communication channels, and build systems that could function even if key personnel withdrew their cooperation. This wasn't paranoia, it was prudent management of human nature. But preparation goes beyond defensive measures. The skilled leader learns to identify opposition before it becomes betrayal, often by recognizing early warning signs that others miss. These include gradual changes in communication patterns, increased questioning of decisions that were previously accepted, subtle distancing from controversial initiatives, and new relationships with people who have competing interests. I developed what I call the loyalty audit, a regular assessment of whether key supporters still benefit from their association with your leadership. This isn't about questioning their character, but about understanding their incentives. When someone's circumstances change in ways that make continued support costly or dangerous, you can either adjust their role or prepare for their eventual departure. Sometimes opposition can be converted into alliance through strategic concessions or changed circumstances. During Florence's conflicts with various Tuscan cities, I witnessed enemies become allies when their interests shifted due to external threats. The key was maintaining enough strength that reconciliation seemed attractive, while avoiding actions that created permanent enmity. However, some opposition must be neutralized rather than converted. When dealing with threats to your core authority, swift and decisive action often prevents escalation better than attempted compromise. The opponent who seeks to destroy your position entirely won't be satisfied with partial concessions. They'll view them as evidence of weakness and press their advantage harder. Modern leaders face the same dynamics whether they're dealing with workplace politics, business competition, or organizational change. The colleague who undermines your initiatives, the rival who questions your competence, or the subordinate who works against your decisions will require strategic responses based on accurate assessment of their motivations and capabilities. The broken sword hilt reminded me that leaders who survive aren't those who never face betrayal, but those who handle it effectively when it inevitably occurs. The theatrical mask collection that I studied during my analysis of successful rulers taught me that leadership requires different presentations for different audiences, not from dishonesty, but from the recognition that effective communication adapts to its context while maintaining core authenticity. These ornate masks, worn by actors who brought ancient stories to life, showed me that managing your public image is a strategic necessity, not vanity. I learned this principle while observing Pope Julius II's masterful use of symbolism and ceremony. When addressing cardinals about theological matters, Julius presented himself as a scholarly priest, speaking quietly and referencing scripture ostensibly. When rallying troops before battle, he appeared in military dress, spoke with commanding authority, and emphasized victory and glory. When negotiating with foreign ambassadors, he adopted the measured dignity of a statesman concerned with justice and stability. Each presentation was authentic to Julius's character, but each emphasized different aspects of his personality and capabilities. He wasn't being deceptive, he was ensuring that his audiences could connect with the qualities most relevant to their relationship with papal authority. The cardinals needed to see spiritual leadership, the soldiers needed to see military command, and the diplomats needed to see political wisdom. This taught me that public image isn't about creating false impressions, but about highlighting true qualities that serve specific purposes. The leader who presents exactly the same personality in every context often fails to communicate effectively because different situations require different types of authority and different emotional tones. During my diplomatic missions, I observed that successful leaders understood what I call audience-appropriate authenticity. When Florence's Gonfalonier met with merchant guilds, he emphasized fiscal responsibility and commercial expertise. When addressing military commanders, he focused on strategic thinking and decisive action. When speaking to common citizens, he highlighted justice and protection of their interests. Each presentation was truthful, but each emphasized the aspects of his leadership most relevant to that particular audience. The key insight is that people need to see the version of your leadership that addresses their specific concerns and interests. A team leader speaking to technical staff should emphasize competence and problem-solving ability. The same leader addressing executives should emphasize strategic vision and results. The same leader talking to new team members should emphasize support and development. Each context requires different emphases while maintaining underlying consistency. Modern leaders must master this principle whether they're managing diverse teams, presenting to different stakeholder groups, or building professional reputations. The executive who uses identical communication styles with board members, employees, and customers often fails to connect effectively with any of these groups because each has different needs and different ways of evaluating leadership credibility. I developed what I call the contextual authenticity framework, identifying core values and capabilities that remain constant across all presentations, then adapting communication style, emphasis, and examples to match each audience's priorities and communication preferences. This isn't manipulation, it's effective leadership communication. The theatrical masks also taught me about the power of symbols and ceremonies in shaping perception. People need visible representations of abstract concepts like authority, competence, and commitment. The leader who neglects these symbolic dimensions often finds their substantive achievements undervalued because they haven't helped others understand their significance. Whether it's the way you dress for important meetings, the ceremonies you create around significant achievements, or the stories you tell about your organization's values, these symbolic elements shape how others interpret your leadership. The wise prince controls these interpretations, rather than leaving them to chance or allowing others to define them negatively. The ancient battle standard that dominated my study represented a truth that transcends warfare. Every leader must think strategically about competition, conflict, and the deployment of resources to achieve objectives against opposition. This weathered banner, carried into battles where the stakes were literally life and death, taught me that military principles apply to any situation where you face organized resistance to your goals. My military education began during Florence's siege of Pisa, where I served as a liaison between civilian leadership and field commanders. I expected warfare to be primarily about courage and firepower, but I discovered it was fundamentally about information, logistics, and psychological pressure. The army that knew more about enemy positions, maintained better supply lines, and preserved higher morale among its forces usually won regardless of numerical advantages. This experience taught me that military thinking isn't about violence. It's about systematic problem-solving under pressure against intelligent opposition. Whether you're launching a new product against entrenched competitors, implementing organizational change against internal resistance, or advancing your career in a competitive environment, you face similar strategic challenges. The first military principle I applied to civilian leadership was terrain analysis. Just as generals study the physical landscape to understand advantages and vulnerabilities, effective leaders analyze their competitive environment to identify opportunities and threats. In business terms, this means understanding market conditions, regulatory constraints, technological trends, and stakeholder relationships that will influence your success. During my observations of various military campaigns, I learned that superior forces often lose because they don't understand the terrain they're fighting in. They make assumptions based on previous experience in different environments, or they focus on their own strengths without considering how environmental factors might neutralize those advantages. The second crucial principle was force concentration, ability to bring superior resources to bear at decisive points, rather than spreading your efforts equally across all fronts. I watched commanders lose winnable battles because they tried to be strong everywhere, instead of achieving overwhelming advantage where it mattered most. Modern leaders must apply this same thinking. The manager who tries to excel at every possible initiative often achieves mediocrity across all areas. The entrepreneur who attempts to serve every potential market segment usually fails to dominate any of them. Strategic thinking requires identifying the crucial battles that will determine overall success and concentrating your best resources on winning those specific engagements. The third military principle that shaped my political thinking was the importance of reserves, maintaining uncommitted resources that can be deployed when unexpected opportunities or threats emerge. I observed that successful commanders never committed their entire force to initial attacks because they understood that battle conditions change rapidly and require adaptive responses. This principle applies directly to modern leadership challenges. Whether you're managing budgets, allocating staff time, or planning your own professional development, maintaining reserve capacity allows you to respond effectively to changing circumstances without being paralyzed by previous commitments. The final military lesson that transformed my approach to leadership was understanding that the enemy gets a vote. Your opponents aren't passive obstacles, they're intelligent actors who will adapt their strategies in response to your moves. Effective planning anticipates these responses and prepares counter-responses accordingly. The battle standard in my study reminded me daily that leadership often involves conflict, and conflict requires strategic thinking that goes far beyond good intentions and hard work. The principles that win battles can win any competitive endeavor when applied with intelligence and appropriate adaptation to civilian contexts. The Florentine gold florin that I kept as a reminder of economic reality taught me that political power without financial foundation is merely borrowed authority that can be revoked at any moment by those who control the resources. This gleaming coin, stamped with the Lily of Florence and accepted throughout Europe, represented the truth that sustainable leadership requires understanding the relationship between wealth and influence. My education in economic strategy began during Florence's financial crisis of 1494, when French military demands threatened to bankrupt our republic. I witnessed how quickly our diplomatic options narrowed as our treasury emptied. Allied cities that had respected Florentine leadership suddenly questioned our judgment. Foreign powers that had sought our partnership began treating us as supplicants. Our enemies grew bolder because they understood that financial weakness would soon translate into military vulnerability. This crisis taught me that money isn't just a tool for purchasing goods and services. It's a strategic resource that enables or constrains every other form of power. The prince who ignores economic fundamentals will find their political authority constantly threatened by financial limitations they can't overcome through charm or intelligence alone. During my diplomatic missions, I observed that the most successful leaders understood what I call resource leverage, the ability to accomplish more with available funds than their rivals achieved with greater resources. Venice exemplified this principle by focusing their spending on naval capabilities that protected their trade routes rather than trying to maintain large land armies that would have bankrupted them without providing strategic advantage. The key insight was that effective resource management isn't about minimizing costs, it's about maximizing the strategic value derived from each expenditure. The wise prince invests in capabilities that generate future resources rather than consuming current wealth on projects that provide only temporary benefits. I learned to distinguish between three types of spending: consumption that provides immediate satisfaction but no lasting value, investment that builds future capacity to generate resources, and strategic expenditure that strengthens your position relative to competitors. Successful leaders minimize the first category, optimize the second, and carefully calculate the third. Modern leaders face identical choices whether they're managing corporate budgets, department resources, or personal finances. The executive, who spends lavishly on impressive offices while neglecting employee development, is consuming rather than investing. The manager who allocates budget to training that builds team capabilities is making strategic investments. The professional who spends money on education and networking is thinking like a prince about resource leverage. During Florence's negotiations with various Italian powers, I discovered that financial independence provided negotiating advantages that couldn't be achieved through any other means. When you don't desperately need what others can provide, you can bargain from strength rather than desperation. When you have resources that others want, you attract alliances rather than having to pursue them. This taught me that building economic strength should be a constant priority for any leader, not just during times of obvious financial pressure. The leader who waits until they need resources to begin building wealth will find themselves negotiating from weakness precisely when they need maximum leverage. I developed what I call economic strategic thinking, evaluating every major decision based on its long-term impact on your resource position. This includes considering opportunity costs, understanding how current choices affect future options, and building systems that generate sustainable value rather than requiring constant input to maintain. The gold florin reminded me that while money can't buy every form of power, poverty eliminates most forms of power. The prince who masters economic strategy creates the foundation that makes all other leadership capabilities more effective. The private seal ring that I used for my most confidential correspondence taught me that successful leadership requires distinguishing between public allies and private confidants, those who support your initiatives and those who share your deepest strategic thinking. This simple signet, pressed into wax on documents that could have destroyed careers if intercepted, represented the delicate balance between transparency and necessary secrecy that every comms leader must master. I learned this distinction during the complex negotiations surrounding the League of Cambrai, when European powers were realigning against Venice. Florence needed to navigate between French, papal, and imperial interests without alienating any party permanently. Our public position supported diplomatic resolution, but our private communications revealed much more nuanced thinking about which outcomes would best serve Florentine interests. The challenge was that our negotiating team included people who served different functions. Some were skilled at public diplomacy. They could articulate our official positions persuasively and maintain positive relationships with various parties. Others possessed analytical capabilities that helped us understand the real motivations and constraints affecting each negotiating partner. A few had access to information sources that provided crucial intelligence about secret agreements and hidden alliances. Each type of contributor was valuable, but they required different levels of access to sensitive information. The public diplomats needed to believe in our stated positions to communicate them authentically, even if those positions were tactical rather than strategic. The analysts needed broader context to provide useful insights, but they didn't need to know operational details that might compromise ongoing intelligence gathering. The intelligence sources required operational information, but couldn't be trusted with strategic planning that might conflict with their other loyalties. This taught me that information management isn't about hoarding secrets. It's about ensuring that each person receives the information necessary for their role, while protecting information that could be dangerous if it reached the wrong people. The leader who shares everything with everyone creates unnecessary risks, while the leader who shares nothing with anyone eliminates the benefits of collaborative thinking. I developed what I call concentric circles of confidence, different levels of access based on each person's role, demonstrated reliability, and potential conflicts of interest. The innermost circle includes people who share your fundamental objectives and have proven their discretion under pressure. The middle circle includes competent allies who support your initiatives but have their own primary loyalties. The outer circle includes functional collaborators who contribute specific capabilities without needing broad strategic context. Modern leaders must apply this same framework whether they're managing corporate strategy, departmental planning, or personal career development. The colleague who helps implement your initiatives doesn't necessarily need to know your long-term career plans. The mentor who provides strategic advice may not be the right person to discuss operational challenges. The friend who offers emotional support might not have the expertise to evaluate business decisions. The key insight is that different relationships serve different purposes, and trying to combine all functions in single relationships often compromises all of them. Your closest strategic advisor may not be your best public advocate. Your most loyal supporter may not be your most objective analyst. Your most trustworthy confidant may not be your most effective implementer. During my years in government service, I learned that the most dangerous mistakes come from misjudging someone's appropriate circle of confidence. Sharing strategic information with people who belong in operational roles creates unnecessary exposure to leaks or betrayal. Excluding strategic allies from necessary planning creates confusion and undermines implementation. The private seal ring reminded me that leadership involves managing information as carefully as managing people and resources. The prince who masters this balance can leverage collaborative wisdom while protecting essential secrets. The succession scrolls that documented the transfer of power between generations taught me that the greatest princes are those who build systems that survive and thrive after their personal involvement ends. These ancient documents, detailing how authority would pass from one leader to another, represented the difference between temporary success and lasting impact on the world. I witnessed this principle most clearly during the transition following Pope Alexander VI's death in 1503. Alexander had been a masterful political operator who expanded papal territories, strengthened Vatican finances, and outmaneuvered numerous rivals during his reign. But he had focused entirely on immediate objectives without preparing for succession. When he died unexpectedly, his carefully constructed alliances collapsed within weeks, because they had been built around his personal relationships rather than institutional structures. Compare this to the legacy of Cosimo de' Medici, who spent decades creating systems that would preserve Medici influence long after his death. Cosimo established banking networks that operated according to clear principles rather than personal whims. He built relationships between institutions rather than just between individuals. He created cultural foundations that gave the Medici family permanent status in Florentine society. Most importantly, he trained successors who understood these systems and could adapt them to changing circumstances. This contrast taught me that succession planning isn't about choosing heirs, about building institutions that can function effectively under different leadership styles and changing external conditions. The prince who makes themselves indispensable may achieve great personal success, but they guarantee that their achievements will die with them. During my service to Florence, I learned to distinguish between personal leadership capabilities and transferable systems. My diplomatic skills were valuable for specific negotiations, but they couldn't be passed to successors. However, the information networks I built, the analytical frameworks I developed, and the relationships I established between Florentine institutions and foreign powers could serve future diplomats, regardless of their individual personalities. This realization led me to focus on what I call institutional legacy building, creating procedures, relationships, and capabilities that would strengthen my organization even after my departure. Instead of hoarding knowledge and relationships, I documented successful approaches, trained others in analytical methods, and facilitated direct connections between colleagues and important external contacts. Modern leaders face the same choice between personal indispensability and institutional strength. The manager who insists on approving every decision may feel powerful, but they create organizations that can't function without constant supervision. The executive who develops strong lieutenants and clear procedures creates teams that can excel, even during their absence. The most challenging aspect of succession planning is accepting that your successors may achieve greater success than you did. This requires the emotional maturity to celebrate others' accomplishments rather than feeling threatened by them. During my later years, I took pride in watching diplomats I had trained negotiate agreements that exceeded my own achievements. Their success validated the institutional capabilities we had built together. I learned that effective succession planning must address three levels: immediate operational continuity, medium-term strategic adaptation, and long-term institutional evolution. Your immediate successor needs systems that can maintain current operations without disruption. Future leaders need flexibility to adapt your approaches to new challenges. Institutional heirs need fundamental principles that can guide decision-making across multiple generations of leadership. The succession scrolls reminded me that true princes measure their success not by the power they accumulate during their lifetimes, but by the positive impact that continues long after they're gone. The leader who builds lasting institutions creates a form of immortality that no personal achievement can match. Your greatest legacy isn't what you accomplished personally, it's what others can accomplish because of the foundations you established. For them, the original manuscript of The Prince that sits before me as I write these words represents 5 centuries of proven wisdom about power, leadership, and human nature. This document, written during my exile from active politics, has guided leaders through Renaissance intrigue, Enlightenment, revolution, industrial transformation, and now digital disruption. The principles endure because they address eternal aspects of human behavior rather than temporary circumstances. As I reflect on everything I've shared with you, I want you to understand that thinking like a prince isn't about adopting a particular personality or abandoning your moral principles. It's about accepting responsibility for outcomes. In a world where good intentions alone are insufficient to achieve good results, it's about understanding that leadership requires strategic thinking, not just ethical thinking. The modern world presents challenges I never could have imagined during my lifetime in Renaissance Italy. Your organizations are more complex, your communications are instantaneous, and your stakeholders are more diverse than anything I experienced. But the fundamental dynamics of power, influence, and human motivation remain remarkably consistent. People still respond to incentives, still pursue their perceived interests, and still respect leaders who demonstrate competence and consistency. What this means for you, as a modern prince, is that the principles I've outlined throughout our conversation are not historical curiosities. They're practical tools for navigating contemporary leadership challenges. Whether you're managing remote teams, launching digital ventures, or building global partnerships, you're dealing with the same basic human dynamics that shaped political success in my era. The lion and fox principle applies whether you're negotiating software contracts or Renaissance treaties. The importance of strategic timing matters whether you're launching products or launching military campaigns. The necessity of managing alliances remains crucial whether you're building business partnerships or political coalitions. The balance between being feared and loved still determines leadership effectiveness, regardless of your industry or organization. But you face one challenge that I never encountered: the speed and transparency of modern communication. In my time, we could make mistakes privately and correct them before they became public knowledge. We could test strategies with limited audiences before implementing them broadly. We could manage our reputations through careful control of information flow. You have no such luxury. Your decisions are visible immediately to vast audiences. Your mistakes become permanent records that can be retrieved and analyzed indefinitely. Your strategic thinking must account for stakeholders who have access to information that would have been secret in my era. This reality requires you to master what I call transparent strategic thinking, the ability to pursue sophisticated objectives through methods that can withstand public scrutiny. You must be more honest about your motivations, more ethical in your methods, and more accountable for your results than previous generations of leaders. But this isn't a weakness, it's an opportunity. The modern prince, who learns to think strategically while maintaining integrity, possesses advantages that weren't available in my time. Transparent leadership builds trust that enhances rather than undermines strategic effectiveness. Ethical methods create sustainable competitive advantages that manipulation cannot match. Your calling as a modern prince is to demonstrate that strategic thinking and moral leadership are complementary rather than competing values. You can build lasting influence through competence rather than fear. You can achieve ambitious objectives while serving others' legitimate interests. You can accumulate power in ways that strengthen rather than corrupt your character. The manuscript before me has shaped 5 centuries of leadership because it addressed timeless truths about human nature and power dynamics. Your opportunity is to write the next chapter of princely wisdom, showing how these eternal principles can be applied with integrity in an interconnected, transparent, rapidly changing world. Think like a prince, lead like a prince, but be a prince worthy of the title.